you were flogged. Many peasants actually fled the British lands, the British East India Company run lands, for princely states because they were treated like human beings there. And on top of that, of course, they were reduced to poverty by the rapacious extractions of the British tax collector. Again, all this is documented at the time. This is not all with retrospective effect. It's just that people didn't focus enough on it. The result was indeed the situation where, as I mentioned, at the end of 1947, we had 90% of our population below the poverty line and mostly living in agricultural areas that they couldn't sustain.
Now, of course, this raises the question, and I'm sure it's occurred to many people, can we put a figure on how much the British extracted from India? And you quote a couple of figures in your book. You quote a British author called William Digby, who said that in the 19th century alone, Britain extracted £4,187,000,000. You quote another figure where you say that in the earlier period, 1765 to 1815, they extracted roughly on average 18 million per year. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of money in today's money, but at the time it was astronomical. But the question is, how accurate are these assessments?
Well, they are contested, of course, by the apologists for the British Empire, but Digby's book is 790 pages long. And in many ways, it builds upon and echoes some of the work done by Dadabhai Naoroji in his famous Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, in which he again cites accounts and statements of the East India Company and of Her Majesty's government, of Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who was a British-educated Indian nationalist who talked about the economic drain. So there's a lot of evidence, I think, to buttress these figures. I would argue that the exact figures may not matter, but $4 billion in the 19th century is somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 billion today. We're talking a phenomenal amount of money. And at the same time, I've also gone into some of the anecdotes of how rich individual Britons and an entire class of sort of returning Brits from India, the nabobs as they were called, became through the process of plunder, loot, and extraction from India. The truth is that even if the numbers can or cannot be exactly quantified, the sums were vast. You can look at some of these statements where words like miscellaneous and arrears completely conceal the fact that India, which ought to have had a net surplus, was actually showing a deficit every year because all the money was being shipped for inexplicable, under inexplicable account headings to Britain. So I won't go so far as to put a number on it, but the sums were vast. And to take a country which accounted for 23% of global GDP and reduce it to a poverty-stricken land with less than 3% of global GDP shows you already how much extraction actually took place right there.
Don't put a number on it, but I think there is a conclusion in your book that I've spotted, which in a sense sums up the impact the British Raj had on the Indian economy. And I'm going to quote that sentence and ask you if you believe that is your conclusion. You write, by the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's biggest source of revenue, the world's biggest purchaser of British exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants and soldiers, all at India's own expense. And then you add, Indians paid, in other words, for the privilege of being conquered by the British. Am I right in saying, with regard to the economy, that is probably your conclusion?
Absolutely. In fact, we literally paid for our own impression, and these British civil servants were the highest paid civil service in the world. They made more than the equivalents in America or even in Britain itself. It's amazing, you know, if you join the Imperial Civil Service, 24 years was the extent of your service, 4 years of which was spent on furlough back home in England, fully paid, of course, and that entitled you to a lifetime pension, all paid for by the Indian taxpayer. The sums were mind-boggling. In fact, again, I've quoted some of the sums, and there are many books that go into the details of how much money was being paid every year out of Indian revenues just to sustain the civil service, and then, of course, to sustain the pensions of those who had served in the civil service. It really was quite outrageous, but everything else as well. The exploitation. In the preface, I mentioned that one Indian journalist actually computed what he thought would be a fair sum of reparations to compensate for the drain, but he came up with a number so astronomical that it was equivalent to the entire GDP of Britain. And obviously such a sum couldn't possibly be paid. But it just shows you that the loot was extensive and long-lasting.
Now, as I said, one area where your book is extremely strong and convincing is when you discuss the impact of the Raj on the economy. The other area where you're equally devastating is when you show the way the British handled famine, and in particular were either neglectful or worse still, actually worked to exacerbate it. You point out in your book that between 1770 and 1900, 25 million Indians died of famine, and you add that if you increased the figure by including the toll of the 20th century, it goes up to 35 million. Tell the audience, how does that compare with the deaths that happened during Stalin's collectivization drive or Mao's cultural revolt? Revolution.
Well, and the fact is that it's right up there with the worst atrocities of humankind. There are disputes about how many people Stalin killed in the period of his rule. I've seen figures as low, quote unquote, as 20 million, as high as 33. As far as Mao is concerned, at least 15 million, perhaps 20, were killed in the Cultural Revolution, more in the larger period of his rule. So the 35 million actually outstrips them both. What's striking is that the British did this quite deliberately. The whole attitude to famine policy was actually based on what the British considered principle. The first principle being that of free trade, that free trade required no intervention in market forces. Second principle was Malthusian, that is that if people were dying from famine, that was because the land couldn't sustain the population, so you should let them die, because that was nature reasserting the sustainable capacity of nature. And the third principle was fiscal prudence. Don't spend money you haven't budgeted for, so if a famine occurs, don't pay money for it, because that's against all the rules of sound government. Now that actually meant that not only did they not help in famines, they actually continued blithely doing their own thing. They would export grains from starving areas back home to Britain. This happened in the famous Orissa famine of 1866, which caused great guilt and anguish to the then Secretary of State for India, Lord Salisbury, but they still went ahead. In the case of Lord Lytton, the Viceroy in the 1880s, he actually acted against both officials who were considered too soft on famine victims, and even private individuals who, out of their own compassion and heart, wanted to help victims of famine through charitable actions. They were punished and threatened with deportation back to England for helping starving Indians. And the worst example, of course, was Winston Churchill, that appalling figure of the 20th century, who during the Great Bengal Famine, which was caused by British policies, Churchill actually ordered the shipment of grains from Bengal that could have fed starving and dying people to buffer reserve stocks in Europe during World War II. Not even to actually feed the Tommies who were fighting in the war, but just for reserve stocks. And when he was told that as a result 4 million people died in Bengal and these people were dying, his only comment was, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" Now that is this appalling figure whom the Brits sadly hail as an apostle of democracy and liberty, when he was clearly, he has more blood on his hands than most world leaders in the 20th century.
But the amazing thing is that your book shows that there were several, maybe even many, Brits, scholars, politicians, historians, who were aware of what the British were doing, who were pretty blunt in expressing it, and yet that seemed to make no difference to them because they carried on. For instance, you quote in your book a gentleman called F.G. Shaw, who in 1857 said to the House of Commons, "The fundamental principle of the English has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient in every possible way to the interests and benefits of themselves." Roughly 80 years later, Sir William Hicks, who was actually Home Secretary at the time, said, "I know it's said in missionary meetings that we conquered India to raise the level of the Indians. That is cant. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. We went with a yardstick in one hand and a sword in the other. And with the latter we continue to hold them helpless whilst we force the former down their throats." So they could be pretty brutally frank about what they were doing, but they carried on doing it.
Well, they were brutally frank mainly in private, in communications amongst themselves or in remarks made behind closed doors. Of course, the records kept were rather meticulous, so a lot of this has survived. But some of the most damning things, for example, were said in closed-door testimony before select committees of the House of Commons, or indeed in private correspondence. Lord Lytton's frank admission to London that nobody had any intention of treating fairly or equally the Indians who got into the Indian civil service, something the British were citing as an example of their sort of preparing Indians for governance. Said, no way we're going to give them any real power. We know it. Between hypocrisy, in other words, deception, and simply just admitting the truth and saying we shouldn't hire these people, we've chosen the less honorable course, said Lytton. That is, of hiring Indians and giving them no real authority. But that's what the British did. And it's very interesting, all this information that has survived, because it does reveal unfortunately, in many ways, I think the most interesting and accurate histories are those written before the invention of the telephone or of easy jet travel. Because how much is not documented today because it's said that could not have been said in them. I mean, there's no way Lytton could have communicated with London except by writing. And similarly, the only way that you could keep records of anything going on was in a way that could then be shared with others, had to be in writing. And so a lot has survived from that period that perhaps people writing histories of today would find much more difficult to retain, especially after WikiLeaks. I suspect a lot of things are not being committed to paper anymore in the darkest recesses of unjust government actions.
All right, Shashi, let's now have a little bit of fun. So far, we've talked about those aspects of your book where your case against the British is strong and convincing. Let's flip and come to aspects where perhaps your case is less convincing, maybe even questionable. And what I'm talking about now are areas where many people believe the British Raj had a beneficial impact on India. And I'm going to start by quoting Dr. Manmohan Singh, speaking in Oxford in 2005. He was Prime Minister at the time. He says, it's possible for an Indian Prime Minister to assert that India's experience with Britain had its beneficial consequences too. And he lists the following: the rule of law, constitutional government, a free press, a professional civil service, modern universities, the judiciary, the army, the police, and of course the English language, the only language that makes communication possible between you and me. And let me begin by putting this to you. Can you at least accept that the British colonial experience was markedly, if not significantly different, to the colonial experience of Spanish colonies, Portuguese colonies, French colonies, Dutch, and undoubtedly the Belgians?
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on all these other colonists, though I do know the Belgians were particularly awful. Certainly, I don't think the French would suffer by comparison with the British. But having said that, the entire point is all these things, and I, of course, agree with the man I respect greatly, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, about the fact that these benefits existed, but they were not intended to be benefits for Indians. Every single one of those examples is of matters designed by the British in their own interests or to further their own rule and control of India. The fact that we have subsequently latched onto them, in many cases transformed them for our own benefit as an independent nation, is to our credit, not to the British. I'll take some of the examples you've given. Rule of law. What was the rule of law the British gave us? First of all, they essentially had a coercive colonial legal system that was meant to oppress. The sedition law, for example, was a classic instance where they actually wrote a law for India that was tougher than that applicable in England. And I quote a British official as saying that he did so because this is not a rule designed for our own people, but to oppress the subject people. You also had a rule of law under which an Englishman could murder an Indian with impunity. In the entire history of the British Raj of 200 years, only 4 convictions have ever occurred of British people for killing Indians, whereas there were hundreds of murders, including the famous cases of people being kicked to death by the quote-unquote stout British boot, simply for being, for example, servants whom their masters were dissatisfied with. And they were never found guilty, whereas Indians were constantly found guilty, were hanged, were blown from the mouths of cannons, were transported to the Andamans and so on for far lesser infractions.
I won't defend the British over the murder thing that you just mentioned. But look, when it comes to sedition, I accept your point that the British gave India a harder sedition law than they gave themselves. But Nehru retained it consciously, maybe with regret, but deliberately. And it's been retained up till today. You also say that the British gave us Section 377, but every single Indian government has retained it. And yours was in power after the Delhi High Court judgment, when you could have used that as an opportunity to repeal 377, but you didn't. So the point about the oppressive legacy, that's your phrase in the book, created by 377, created by sedition, is A, that in one form or another those laws applied at that time in Britain as well, but B, Britain has gone on to repeal them. We sadly have not just retained them, we've embraced them.
No, I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, I've said in the book in repeated places that I don't intend this indictment of the past to justify any failures in the present. And as far as I'm concerned, these are things that ought to have been fixed. I've introduced a private member bill in Parliament to try and undo the sedition law by bringing...
Twice! Look at the fate of your bill on 377.
Well, the sedition law first, just to bring it in conformity with the existing Supreme Court judgment that says it should only relate to cases where there's incitement to violence. And then, yes, 377, I find it somewhat ironic that the party of Hindutva actually claiming to speak for a religion that has 2,000 years of recorded tolerance for various kinds of sexual practices and sexual deviancy, a religion that has no recorded instance of persecution or prosecution of such practices, that people speaking for such a party have instead abandoned the option of being true to their own cultural traditions and instead accepted and embraced a Victorian moral code written by Macaulay in 1837, enacted in 1861 and carried on, but abandoned, as you rightly say, by the British in the late 1960s. To my mind, it's bizarre we're still doing this, and I think it is to our discredit. I'm not flinching from admitting that there have been mistakes since independence.
Let's come to another example. Let's come to the press. And I'm only going to quote from evidence that comes from your book itself. As far back, you say, as 1889, the Bengali newspaper, and I may be mispronouncing its name, Hali Shahar Patrika, called the British Lieutenant Governor of the day the baboon Campbell with a hairy body. 2 years later, in 1891, a journalist from Amrit Bazar Patrika rummaged in the Viceroy's waste paper bucket, put together the fragments of a torn-up letter, published it in the paper, and thus thwarted Britain's attempts to annex Kashmir. Now, if either of those had happened today, I don't think you need me to tell you what the government of the day would have done, and that would apply whether Mr. Modi was Prime Minister or Dr. Manmohan Singh. Both of them would have throttled the newspaper. God knows what they'd have done to the journalists. But the British in 1889 and 1891 did nothing. They accepted it and tolerated it. Surely that is proof of freedom of the press.
Yes and no, Karan. First of all, on the Hali Shahar Patrika's abuse, fact is, this didn't hurt the British. I mean, they had no problem with people using invective or abuse. They felt it was even mildly amusing. What they objected to was if the same paper would have gone on to call for the overthrow of this hairy baboon or replacing him with an Indian ruler or whatever, that would have been sedition. Secondly, all the laws on press freedom were actually massively anti-Indian. To begin with, there was a Vernacular Press Act, which is why the Amrita Bazar Patrika actually turned itself from a Bengali paper into an English one, because it was tough to be a vernacular paper under the Vernacular Press Act. Secondly, Indian papers had to pay a very, very high, almost punitive deposit money, which was easily forfeit if you wrote anything the British didn't like. Third, all the examples of editors and reporters who've been punished, jailed, incarcerated, shipped off to the Andamans for transportation, presses smashed, confiscated, etc., all of those relate to Indian liberal publications, nationalist publications, never done to any of the British, who used equal amounts of invective against Indian nationalists, by the way, and even openly advocated. I've quoted one example where a British Indian newspaper openly advocated the killing of Indians by Brits, and nothing was done to them, whereas had something been done in reverse, that would have been the end of the paper and the editor concerned. So there were double standards throughout. Now, I will concede one thing, which is that, of course, because Britain had evolved certain standards in its own homeland of freedoms and civilities, they did feel obliged themselves to practice those standards in India, and therefore, indeed, it was better in the end for India to have been colonized by democracy than by, say, an absolute monarchy or an autocracy or a dictatorship. But the fact in the end was...
We are equally double-standard.
No, I'm not disagreeing. As I said, let me not excuse anything in the present. And certainly, I do not condone what NDTV did to Mr. Chidambaram's interview, nor do I particularly